Hidden in the neglected corners of biblical history lies the story of a woman too dangerous to fit neatly inside the obedience most people expect from Scripture. While many believers know Esther as the woman who saved her people from destruction, there was another heroine, older, fiercer, and far more unsettling. She was a widow who walked into the camp of the most feared general on earth, carried beauty like a weapon, spoke with the confidence of a prophet, and returned before dawn with a severed head in her hands. Her name was Judith, and the book that preserved her story would later be embraced by some churches, questioned by others, and pushed to the edges by those who never quite knew what to do with a woman who defeated empire, not by accident, but by terrifying moral clarity. Why did her story survive in some Bibles and disappear from others? And what is it about Judith that still unsettles readers centuries later? Today, we are opening that silence and following the path of one of the boldest women ever placed inside the world of Scripture. The story begins not with triumph, but with a nation already bent under fear. An army was moving across the earth like a storm that no walls seemed able to stop. Kingdom after kingdom had already fallen. Cities had opened their gates or watched them burn. Men who had once spoken proudly of their gods now knelt in the dust before a power greater than anything they had imagined. The king behind this terror was Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of a vast empire, a man whose ambition had outgrown politics and become something almost religious. He did not simply want victory. He wanted submission. He wanted the nations to acknowledge that resisting him was the same as resisting fate itself. And to make that fate visible, he sent one of his most terrifying servants. His name was Holofernes. He was not just a commander. He was a living instrument of imperial will. Wherever he marched, altars were torn down, loyalties were tested, and fear spread faster than his soldiers. Villages emptied at the rumor of his approach. Leaders argued over whether resistance was bravery or suicide. And in the middle of that spreading crisis stood a small hill town whose name most armies would have considered insignificant. Bethulia. But history often turns in places empire barely notices. Bethulia was not a great city. It was not wealthy, not famous, and not built to impress the world. What gave it importance was its position. Whoever controlled Bethulia controlled a strategic route into the heartland beyond it. If the town fell, the way opened. If it held, the invading machine would be slowed, perhaps even broken. That made this little settlement more than a village. It became a gate, and gates attract judgment. As Holofernes advanced, the pressure on Bethulia became unbearable. Its defenders watched the enemy spread around them like a tightening noose. Water supplies were threatened. Food grew scarce. Every day the horizon looked darker. Every night the town slept less. Men went up on the walls and stared at the campfires of the enemy below, counting numbers they could not possibly match. Mothers tried to quiet children who had begun to understand that hunger was no longer temporary. Elders spoke in hushed voices about surrender. Priests called for prayer. Soldiers asked whether prayer would stop arrows. This was not a theoretical crisis. This was the kind of siege that empties courage out of a population one day at a time. The people began as frightened people often do, by asking the right question and the wrong spirit. They asked where God was. But they did not ask with trust. They asked with accusation. If they were the people of the covenant, why were they trapped? If the Lord defended Israel, why had he allowed an empire to stand at their gate? If faith mattered, why were the cisterns drying up? Their leaders tried to hold the line. Ozias And the elders told the people to endure a little longer, to wait, to remain faithful. But fear is patient in a way faith often is not. Hunger sharpened every complaint. Thirst made every promise sound hollow. The mood of the city shifted from fear to resentment, and from resentment to bargaining. That is when the people said something revealing. They demanded a deadline for God. If no deliverance came within a set number of days, they said, the town would surrender. Think about how serious that is for a biblical story. They were not merely afraid. They were trying to place the Almighty on a schedule. Rescue us by our terms, or we will hand ourselves over. That was the spiritual condition of Bethulia when Judith enters the story. She does not arrive as a girl carried by romance or coincidence. She enters as a widow already marked by discipline, sorrow, and reputation. The text describes her as beautiful, yes, but it does not present beauty as her essence. Before beauty comes character. Before attraction comes consecration. Judith had lost her husband Manasseh, and instead of dissolving into despair or disappearing into private grief, she had built a life of fasting, prayer, restraint, and moral seriousness. She lived in relative seclusion, clothed in widowhood, carrying both sorrow and strength in the same body. She was already known. That matters, because Judith is not written as someone who becomes brave only when circumstances force her. She is introduced as a woman whose hidden life has been preparing her long before the crisis becomes public. While soldiers polished weapons and leaders negotiated panic, Judith had been cultivating something harder to see and far more dangerous to a tyrant: inward authority. When she heard what the leaders of Bethulia had said, she was outraged. Not panicked. Outraged. She summoned the elders and confronted them with a moral force that instantly reorders the scene. The town had been speaking as though God were obligated to prove himself on command. Judith refuses that posture completely. She warns them that they are not in a position to test the Lord, to measure divine faithfulness against their own failing nerves, or to speak as though surrender were a reasonable backup plan if heaven did not move quickly enough for them. This is one of the first things that makes Judith so unsettling even now. She does not merely encourage the frightened. She rebukes them. She does not flatter the leadership. She corrects it. She speaks to male authority in a crisis, and does so without apology, because what is at stake is not ego, but covenant. Her words change the atmosphere of the story. Until Judith speaks, Bethulia is a town under siege. After Judith speaks, Bethulia becomes a town under judgment for its unbelief. The external enemy is still there, but now a deeper conflict has been exposed. The real danger is not only Holofernes outside the walls. It is a community inside the walls that has begun to collapse spiritually before it has collapsed militarily. And once that deeper diagnosis is made, Judith reveals something even more remarkable. She has a plan, not just a hope, not just an intention to pray. A plan, but she does not explain it. This is one of the script's most important operational moves. Judith says enough to establish confidence, but not enough to satisfy curiosity. She tells the leaders that God will act through her. She tells them to trust. She tells them to station themselves at the gate and watch. But she refuses to lay out the details in advance. She understands something many modern leaders do not. Some missions collapse when explained too early to frightened people. So a new loop opens. Who is this widow, and what exactly is she about to do? The answer does not come immediately. First, the story slows down and lets us watch preparation. Judith goes to prayer. She does not rush from indignation to action without consecration. Her boldness is not self-generated adrenaline. It is rooted in theology. She prays at length, calling on the God of her ancestors, recalling the history of Israel, the justice of the Lord, the pattern by which human pride rises and is thrown down. She does not speak as someone improvising courage. She speaks as someone locating the present crisis inside a much older story. This is crucial to the way the narrative works. Judith's mission becomes persuasive not because the audience already knows it will succeed, but because the text frames her interior life as aligned with the moral logic of God. In other words, the story asks us to trust her before it asks us to understand her strategy. Then comes one of the most dramatic transformations in all biblical-style literature. Judith removes the visible signs of mourning. The widow who had lived in restraint now washes, anoints herself, arranges her hair and dresses in garments of beauty. Jewelry appears. Fine clothing appears. The language slows down over these details because they are not decorative. They are tactical. This is not vanity. This is war by different means. Judith is not abandoning holiness. She is weaponizing perception. That distinction matters, because weaker stories would present this as seduction for its own sake. Judith is more complicated than that. The narrative repeatedly keeps her inner in tension and outer appearance in tension. Outwardly, she becomes dazzling. Inwardly, she remains set apart. Outwardly, she enters the visual logic of the enemy camp. Inwardly, she has already rejected that world. And at this point, the stakes rise again. She is going out alone? Well, not completely alone. She takes her maid with her. But in military terms, in social terms, in bodily vulnerability, Judith is stepping across the line between the protected interior of her people and the exposed space of imperial power. She leaves the city at night. Gates open. Those who had mocked, complained, and doubted can do nothing now but watch her descend. It is one of the great threshold moments in sacred storytelling. A widow walks out of a starving town and into the camp of the enemy. The men on the walls cannot protect her. The elders cannot guide her. The army of Israel cannot escort her. If her plan fails, she will be humiliated, violated, or killed, and her town will likely fall soon after. The entire mission rests on a combination so unlikely that it almost sounds impossible. Beauty, intelligence, timing, nerve, and absolute confidence in divine judgment. When the enemy patrol finds her, the story opens another layer of suspense. She is exactly what a besieging army is not prepared for. Not a soldier, not a spy in the obvious sense, not a messenger under flag of truce. She appears as a woman leaving the doomed city. A defector, perhaps. A survivor. A beautiful mystery carrying information. And Judith knows how to speak to power. This is another major element in the script's DNA. She never speaks to Holofernes and his men as a helpless victim. She speaks with calculated ambiguity. She suggests that Bethulia is on the edge of offending God and that she has insight into when that offense will mature into disaster. She implies that she can help the enemy succeed at the exact right time. She frames herself not as prey, but as access. That is how she enters the camp, not by begging for mercy, but by making herself appear useful to ambition. Empire is often easiest to fool when it believes it is being confirmed in its superiority. The soldiers bring her inward. Word spreads quickly. A woman of extraordinary beauty has entered the camp. But the beauty is only the surface. What truly captures attention is her composure. She's not frantic. She is not broken. She does not flatter recklessly. She projects control. Holofernes, like many powerful men before and after him, mistakes that control for availability. He sees elegance and assumes possession is only a matter of time. That assumption will kill him. When Judith is brought before Holofernes, the narrative tightens. This is the encounter the whole setup has been driving toward, but still the answer is delayed. She speaks carefully. He listens. She tells him enough to deepen his confidence in her usefulness, while protecting the deeper reality of her mission. He is intrigued not only because she is beautiful, but because she seems to combine intelligence, piety, and strategic value in one impossible figure. She fascinates him, and fascination is more dangerous than attraction, because it lowers suspicion while increasing desire. Judith requests permission to go out at night to pray. Holofernes grants it. This detail is subtle, but its function is brilliant. It makes her look pious without making her look threatening. It creates routine. It normalizes her movement. It teaches the enemy camp to stop seeing her as a puzzle and start seeing her as part of the environment. Night after night she goes out and returns. Night after night trust grows. Night after night the trap tightens. This is how great stories use repetition. Not to stall, but to sedate. Then the banquet is prepared. Here the script shifts again from strategic suspense to imminent danger. Holofernes arranges a private feast. He intends not merely to host Judith, but to possess her. The text wants us to feel how close the threat has come. Judith has penetrated the center of imperial power, yes, but now she is in the most vulnerable place possible. Private space behind curtains. Near a drunken man who commands life and death. The servants withdraw. The room narrows. The music of public performance ends, and the silence of real risk begins. Holofernes drinks heavily. The story lingers over this because drunkenness is not just a detail. It is a revelation of character. Empire at ease becomes sloppy. Pride that has never truly imagined defeat relaxes at precisely the wrong moment. Holofernes believes the night belongs to him. He believes Judith has entered his world and accepted its rules. He believes desire has already won. He is wrong. And then comes one of the most violent and unforgettable reversals in biblical-style storytelling. Judith stands beside the bed. The general lies senseless. She prays. That matters, too. The act about to happen is not framed as personal vengeance, and not as erotic treachery. It is framed as judgment. She asks for strength. She takes his sword. She seizes him by the hair. And she strikes. Once, then again. The head comes free. The man who had made nations tremble is suddenly reduced to a body on a couch. It is impossible to overstate how radical this moment is. For the entire first half of the narrative, Holofernes has functioned like a moving embodiment of invincibility. Armies organize themselves around his will. Cities measure survival against his approach. Men fear his command before they ever see his face. And in the space of a few lines, all that imperial scale collapses into one dead body and one woman holding proof that the impossible has happened. This is the payoff of the central tension. But notice how the script handles it. It does not end here, because the severed head is not the final reward. It is the hinge. Judith places the head in her food bag with the help of her maid. The image is stark, almost shocking in its intimacy. Then they leave the tent, and because Judith's routine has been normalized, because her nighttime movement has become ordinary to the camp, no one stops the women. The same system that welcomed her in now unknowingly escorts Judgment back out into the dark. She walks back to Bethulia carrying the collapse of empire in a sack. When the gates open and Judith returns, the entire emotional energy of the narrative changes at once. Fear gives way to astonishment. The people who had nearly surrendered now stare at the evidence that deliverance did not come through negotiation, military strength, or deadline-driven panic. It came through obedience, nerve, and a woman they had not imagined as their decisive weapon. She shows them the head. That is the proof. That is the shock. That is the public reversal. The leaders who had been bargaining with despair now have to reorganize themselves around courage. Judith instructs them what to do next. She is not just the assassin of the tyrant. She becomes, for this brief, decisive window, the strategist of the victory. The head is displayed. The enemy sees that its commander is dead. Panic erupts. What seemed impossible a few hours earlier now becomes inevitable in the other direction. Imperial order breaks. Soldiers flee. Israel attacks. The army that had come to devour is scattered instead. And this is where a lesser script would simply celebrate. Judith's story does more than that. Because after the victory, the narrative begins to reveal what kind of woman this actually is. She is praised. She is honored. Songs rise around her. Blessings are spoken over her. She becomes the center of national gratitude. But unlike the conquerors of ordinary history, Judith does not convert triumph into personal empire. She does not seize office. She does not found a dynasty. She does not turn charisma into domination. She returns to a life of dignity, memory, and reverence. That choice is part of why the story has survived. If Judith had merely reversed power to possess it, she would have looked like a mirror image of Holofernes. Instead, the narrative insists that her action was bounded. She stepped into danger for a purpose, completed the act, and stepped back. Her greatness is inseparable from restraint. But Judith's story does not remain only the story of one city, one enemy, one widow, or one astonishing night. As later generations read and retold it, the figure of Judith began to grow into something larger than biography. She became a symbol, not an abstract symbol detached from action, but a living pattern through which communities began to understand how God sometimes works through those least expected by conventional power. This is where the second major escalation begins. The story moves from event to meaning. Jewish communities living under pressure heard Judith as more than a tale of past bravery. They heard in her story a theology of resistance. She represented the possibility that covenant faithfulness could outlast military superiority. That holiness was not weakness. That empires, however massive, often carried within themselves the blindness that would undo them. Judith's victory suggested that the arrogance of the powerful is never merely political. It is spiritual. And because it is spiritual, it can be judged. The details of her story made that symbolism even stronger. She is a widow, which means she begins from a place the ancient world often associated with vulnerability. She is beautiful, but her beauty is not presented as passive ornament. It becomes disciplined strategy. She is devout, but her devotion does not remove her from history. It drives her into its most dangerous center. She is obedient to God, yet she speaks with an authority that unsettles compromised leaders. Again and again, the book refuses easy categories. Judith is not simply gentle, not simply fierce, not simply pious, not simply political. She's all of these at once, fused by purpose. That complexity is one reason later readers never fully agreed on how to handle her. Some loved her immediately. Others admired her, but with caution. Still others seemed to prefer that she remain at the edges, celebrated when useful, but never allowed to become too central. Because Judith raises uncomfortable questions. What do you do with a holy woman who shames male leadership at the opening of the story? What do you do with a heroine who uses appearance strategically without the text condemning her for it? What do you do with a figure who saves the covenant community not through domestic faithfulness alone, but through confrontation, cunning, and blood? What do you do with a book in which prayer and decapitation stand side by side? Those questions mattered more as the history of Scripture unfolded. In some Jewish circles, Judith's story was treasured as a powerful witness to divine deliverance and national courage. In Christian traditions, especially those shaped by Greek and Latin biblical collections, the book found a place among the writings later called deuterocanonical. It was read, preached, painted, sung, and interpreted. Church fathers saw in Judith images of virtue, of Israel, of the church herself triumphing over evil, of the humble overcoming the proud. Artists across centuries became obsessed with the scene in the tent, candlelight, sword, sleeping general, the instant before history changes. Yet even as the book endured, it also drifted toward the margins in other communities. That did not happen all at once. As debates about canon hardened, as questions of language, authorship, and textual history grew more important, Judith became a problem for those who wanted clean lines and uncomplicated authority. The book did not sit easily inside every developing standard. It was not preserved in exactly the same way across all traditions. It carried historical tensions. It used names and imperial settings in ways that invited scrutiny. And beyond those technical concerns lay something deeper that rarely gets admitted openly. Judith was spiritually useful, but institutionally difficult. She was hard to domesticate. A story like Judith can be praised from a distance. It is much harder to absorb without consequence. Because if Judith belongs in the world of Scripture, then readers must reckon with a God who does not always work through the obvious, or the publicly empowered. They must reckon with a woman whose faith is active, confrontational, and strategically intelligent. They must reckon with the possibility that righteousness can appear in forms that disturb the categories of the comfortable. That is one reason the book never disappeared completely, but neither was it always given the same place of honor. It remained alive, but uneasily. In monasteries, in liturgy, in theological commentary, in visual art, Judith kept returning. Her image appeared with sword in hand and head in basket. Her courage was linked with chastity, her beauty with discipline, her act with divine justice. Yet when broader Christian debates narrowed the boundaries of what many communities would print as Scripture, Judith found herself treated differently depending on where one stood. In Catholic and Orthodox traditions, she remained inside the biblical world in a formal sense. In many Protestant traditions, she was moved outward into the Apocrypha, respected by some, ignored by others, excluded from the ordinary Bible of millions. And there is the delayed answer to the opening question. Why did her story survive in some Bibles and disappear from others? Because Judith stood at the crossing point of several tensions that later traditions did not resolve the same way. Tensions about canon, language, textual history, female authority, holy violence, and the uneasy power of stories that do not merely comfort the faithful, but expose them. But even that is not the whole answer, because Judith's problem was never only textual. It was imaginative. She refused to remain small. Every era that encountered her had to decide whether to turn her into a safe moral illustration or face the sharper truth of the narrative. Judith is not safe. She is not a decorative heroine placed in Scripture to add variety. She is a revelation of what faith can look like when compromise has exhausted itself. She appears when leaders are bargaining with fear, when the people are setting deadlines for God, when empire believes it has already won. And then she acts in a way nobody expected, but which afterwards seems almost inevitable. That pattern is powerful. Too powerful, perhaps, for traditions that prefer sanctity to remain quiet, compliant, and symbolic rather than disruptive. And still her story kept working. Readers living under persecution heard hope in her. Preachers facing moral collapse heard rebuke in her. Artists fascinated by beauty and danger found in her a subject that would not let them go. Political movements sometimes appropriated her. So did reformers. So did monarchs. So did revolutionaries. Each age looked at Judith and saw something it needed, feared, or wanted to control. But the core of the story remained unchanged. A full woman saw more clearly than the officials around her. A community on the edge of surrender was recalled to covenant reality by someone it had not expected to lead. Power opened its own doors to the instrument of its downfall. And God's deliverance came through a form that human expectation had not prepared for. That is why the book endured even where its status was disputed. It was too alive to vanish, too memorable to erase, too theologically disruptive to become merely sentimental. And modern readers, perhaps more than ever, can feel that tension, because Judith confronts several instincts common in contemporary religion. She confronts the instinct to reduce faith to inner feeling without public courage. She confronts the instinct to equate gentleness with passivity. She confronts the instinct to imagine that the holy must always arrive in recognizable, institutionally approved forms. Her story suggests something more dangerous, that fidelity to God may require rebuke before comfort, strategy before applause, and courage before explanation. The book also raises a more uncomfortable possibility. Maybe some stories are not pushed to the margins only because of textual questions. Maybe they are pushed there because, if taken seriously, they would force readers to rethink who can speak, who can act, and what divine deliverance is allowed to look like. That does not mean every tradition that questioned Judith acted in bad faith. It does mean the history of reception is never only about manuscripts. Communities preserve or minimize stories, partly because of what those stories authorize in the imagination. And Judith authorizes a kind of holy agency that many systems find difficult to celebrate without anxiety. Look again at the shape of her story. She begins in widowhood, not influence. She enters in prayer, not entitlement. She sees clearly when leaders do not. She acts decisively when others delay. She risks her body where others risk only opinions. She wins without seeking to become what she defeats. And then she leaves behind not a theory, but a memory that generations cannot stop revisiting. This is why Judith belongs to that strange category of scriptural figures who are both revered and inconvenient, like prophets who indict kings, like apostles who disturb the familiar, like saints whose lives expose the poverty of ordinary commitment. Judith cannot be honored honestly without allowing her to challenge the reader. And she still challenges. She challenges every believer who mistakes panic for realism. She challenges every leader who confuses delay with prudence, while others bear the cost. She challenges every community willing to speak about trust while secretly preparing surrender. She challenges every system that welcomes women as symbols, but grows uneasy when they become agents of judgment and deliverance. The final movement of her story, then, is not only about where the book was placed in different canons. It is about why it never stopped returning. Even where Judith was moved into appendices, margins, or secondary status, she remained artistically central. Painters kept painting her. Writers kept writing her. Theologians kept interpreting her. Musicians kept invoking her. Her scene in the enemy camp became one of the most haunting images in the entire biblical imagination. Why? Because it compresses into one unforgettable act so many truths at once: the arrogance of power, the vulnerability of the faithful, the danger of beauty, the necessity of courage, the hiddenness of providence, and the terrible precision with which pride can be judged. That is not easy material, but it is enduring material. And in that sense, Judith's marginalization never fully worked. The book may have been placed differently across traditions, but the woman herself kept cutting her way back into memory. The image was too strong, the reversal too absolute, the character too hard to reduce. Every time a reader encountered her afresh, the same realization returned. This was never a minor figure. This was one of the boldest divine reversals in the world of Scripture. A widow shamed a general. A fasting woman overturned a war machine. A city that had nearly surrendered was saved by the one person who still believed God did not need to obey human timelines. And a book many later readers were not sure how to classify continued to survive, because the story inside it would not let itself be forgotten. So what finally makes Judith so powerful? Not simply that she was brave. Many figures in sacred history are brave. Not simply that she was beautiful. Beauty alone explains nothing. Not simply that she won. Victory without meaning fades quickly. Judith endures because she embodies a pattern the Bible returns to again and again. When human strength hardens into arrogance, when official leadership begins to crack, when fear starts calling itself wisdom, God often works through the person everyone underestimated. But Judith gives that pattern a sharper edge. In her story, deliverance is not only surprising, it is humiliating to the proud. It exposes the blindness of empire and the hesitation of the faithful at the same time. And that is why some loved the book, some argued over it, and some kept it at a distance. Because Judith does not simply reassure, she reveals. She reveals what fear does to a people before defeat ever arrives. She reveals what faith looks like when it stops asking permission from panic. She reveals that holiness can be both devout and dangerous. And she reveals that some of the most unforgettable stories in the biblical world survive precisely because they resist being made comfortable. If you have only heard Judith described as a side story, a disputed book, or a dramatic tale from the margins, then you have not yet met her in full. Judith is not a footnote to Scripture's imagination. She is one of its fiercest tests, a test of whether readers can recognize divine action when it comes clothed in forms their traditions did not center, a test of whether courage still looks holy when it unsettles expectations, a test of whether a community on the edge of surrender can still be called back by a voice it did not expect. That is the mystery of Judith. Not that she existed only in a controversial book, but that once you really see her, you understand why no tradition has ever been able to ignore her completely. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden biblical mystery, subscribe for more stories from Scripture, history, and the forgotten edges of faith. And tell me in the comments, what unsettles you most about Judith? Her courage, her strategy, or the way her story exposes everyone around her? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we open another ancient story that history never fully managed to silence.